welcome everybody. My name is Mark Walsh. I am the Vice Chair of the Council of Christians and Jews Victoria, the recipients of the Victorian Multicultural Commission Award for Excellence in 2017. And I'd like to welcome you here today to our presentation on understanding the war in Ukraine and what led to it, featuring two speakers today, Dr. Daniel Heller and Associate Professor Paula Michaels, both from Monash University. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here joining you from the country of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And the Council of Christians and Jews Victoria acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples in Australia, the traditional owners and custodians of the land and waters throughout this continent. Their sovereignty was never ceded, and as the Uluru Statement from the Heart reminds us, coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. We acknowledge and recognise the rich cultural practices, beliefs, languages and laws which are of ongoing importance. First Peoples have made and continue to make a unique and irreplaceable contribution to Australia. We acknowledge and pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people who are either joining us here live this afternoon or who are watching this video on YouTube. And we commit ourselves to walk softly and gently on this land and through dialogue and action to work actively for reconciliation, justice, equity and healing. Also like to wish Ramadan Kareem to the members of the Muslim community, a kind and gentle fast for them, which will coincide also with significant feasts in the Christian and Jewish calendars. I acknowledge also the assistance of the Sisters of Our Lady of Sion Australia region, who are supporting us through the use of their Zoom platform this afternoon. So thank you for their to them for their support of this event and their continued support of the Council of Christians and Jews since its beginnings in 1985. If you aren't aware of it, we have a website and I'll put up the address for that website at the end of our presentation. You can find out what's going on in the interfaith world. You can see what our next event is, view events that have already happened, access our fantastic journal, Gesher, and also you can sign up to be part of the communication system that we have, our newsletter, and a donation, make donations if you wish. The Council of Christians and Jews Victoria aims to educate Christians and Jews to appreciate each other's distinctive beliefs, practices, and commonalities, to promote the study of and research into historical, political, economic, social, religious, and racial causes of conflicts between people of different creeds and colour, and to promote education in fundamental ethical teachings for the benefit of the community common to Christianity and Judaism that relate to respect and understanding between people of different creeds. And so we return now to our presentation today. I'd like to begin by introducing you to Dr. Daniel Heller, Senior Lecturer, East European Jewish History, Monash University. His areas of research specialisation are East European Jewish history and the history of humanitarian aid and international development and the history of Zionism and modern Israel. And joining him also is Associate Professor Paula Michaels, also from Monash University, Associate Professor of History with interests in Eastern and Western Europe, integrating the USSR into a pan-European and global narrative through the study of social and cultural history. I'm going to let them introduce their talk. They're going to be presenting a presentation moving from one to the other over the next 45 or 50 minutes, after which we will have some time for questions.
I'm Paula Michaels. I'm going to start us off today, and Dan and I are going to kind of ping pong back and forth between the two of us. And we are here to talk to you about understanding the war in Ukraine and what led to it, and just to give you a sense of the overview of how we're going to address this issue. We're going to basically the question is, how did we get here? And we're going to try to give you the background that will help you understand the current situation. We are clearly coming at this strongly from a historical perspective. Neither Dan nor I either have crystal balls or are political scientists. And so we're kind of trying to give you some deep background to understanding the current crisis. Dan will start us off giving us history of Ukraine to 1917, the year of the Bolshevik Revolution. And I will then take over and give us a very quick overview of the history of Soviet Ukraine from, I see a typo, not 1971, 1917 to 91. And then I'll continue on looking at post-Soviet Ukraine with an emphasis on national identity formation. And then Dan is going to take us through the use and abuse of history, looking at Putin, Zelensky, and the memory politics of World War II. And then we can open it up for Q&A. And we're going to try to give you guys plenty of time for that. And Dan, I will stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Paula, and it's such a privilege to have the opportunity to present with you and to also meet with you all on this afternoon. So just bear with me for one moment. I'm now going to share my screen with you, and then once that happens, I can begin discussing with you the history of Ukraine. Okay, so we're just going to start off by presenting a brief overview of the Ukraine's history through several centuries. At first glance, this might seem really strange given that we're talking about a war in the here and now. But what I hope that I can get across to you, I know Paula will as well, is that this history is so critical to understanding what's happening in the here and now, in part because the different sides of this conflict often invoke history and they invoke the past to justify the actions that they are undertaking in the present. So we have to try together to parse what is myth, what is fact, and what lies somewhere in between. So the Ukraine is Europe's second largest country by area. Before the Russian invasion on the 24th of February of this year, there were some 41 million people living in the country. Ukraina literally means borderland in several Slavic languages. And that's because Ukraine really lies at the crossroads of Eastern and Central Europe. Now, the fact that it's a borderland has also meant that this territory has been very much contested. Indeed, for most of the past 500 years, Ukrainian lands have been under the rule of powerful states competing with one another for control over this territory. Prior to Ukrainian independence in 1991, Ukraine existed as an independent state, but only for very brief periods. There is, however, an historical ethnic Ukrainian group. And by that, I mean a group of people that have a Ukrainian identity that is closely tied to language, culture, family, religion. And that ethnic group has existed for many centuries. So what then is the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians, between Ukraine and Russia more broadly? So ethnic Ukrainians are an East Slavic people. They're like Russians or Belarusians. Ethnic Ukrainians were historically a peasant people that lived an agrarian lifestyle, sometimes as serfs. Now, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians all speak related languages. So they all use the Cyrillic alphabet, for example. And many members of these ethnic groups adhere to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Both Ukraine and Russia trace their heritage to the medieval kingdom of Kievan Rus, which was based in Kiev. Between the 16th and the 18th centuries, much of the Ukrainian lands were under the rule of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth between, that's again, the 16th to the 18th century. And you can see here the map of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and here is present-day Ukraine. So how did we get from here to the formation of modern Ukraine? Well, from the late 1700s until 1991, most of what is today's Ukraine was under Russian or Soviet rule. And if you look at this map here, I'm just going to trace with my mouse the borders of present-day Ukraine. And the areas that were in pink were under Russian rule for many, 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 many decades. Only this slice here in white for many decades were under Austro-Hungarian rule. So that's through much of the 19th century and through to the First World War. Now, Russia, as I mentioned, began to conquer Ukrainian lands in the 1600s. They gradually took over much of what is today's Ukraine. They ruled it for centuries. Russia, in fact, referred to Ukraine as Little Russia. The far western territory, as I mentioned, was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Later, between the two world wars, it was part of Poland. It's actually in this white area over here that a Ukrainian nationalist movement emerged in the 19th century, which sometimes set as its goal an independent state. Ukrainian nationalism was permitted to operate in this far western area under Austro-Hungarian rule. Now let's fast forward then to the First World War. An independent Ukraine was declared after the fall of the Russian Empire in 1917, but it was quickly subsumed in the chaos of the Russian Civil War, which lasted between 1917 and 1921. Much of that territory was subsequently subsumed into the Soviet Union. And the far western areas, though that area in white that I mentioned beforehand, the seat and the heart of Ukrainian nationalism, was subsumed into the independent Polish state. Now, before turning over to my colleague Paula to tell us more about the story of Ukraine under Soviet rule, I just want to take a moment to reflect on how the history that I just mentioned to you can tell us a little bit about, or how it can shed light on how Putin views the Ukraine and how he justifies the war that's currently going on. So, as you've already picked up, Russians and Russia has ruled the areas of Ukraine for many, many, many years over the course of the 19th and the 20th centuries. So part of Putin's claim over Ukraine is that he is in fact expanding, not just expanding his power, but in fact bringing back or hearkening back to a Russian empire that existed in the past. So Putin argues that Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist since much of its current territory, as he argues, was actually given to it in past centuries. So if you look at this map over here, this is kind of a map of how Putin thinks about the history of the lands of Ukraine. And he would imagine that this area here in yellow is the only kind of independent area that could constitute Ukraine. All the areas here, according to Putin and according to many Russians that support Putin's ideology, would say that these areas were actually given to Ukraine or granted by either the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. So this is about returning to Russian rule in the area. It's not about invading into an independent state. Another important thing to mention, and I know that Paula will discuss this further, I had mentioned to you some of the important similarities between Ukrainians and Russians. Russian rulers oftentimes capitalized on those similarities and emphasized them and insisted that Ukrainians and Russians were kind of like one spiritual nation. And rather than talk about the differences between the groups, insisted that they were part of a common whole. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague, Paula, who will take us to the story of Ukrainians in the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Dan. So I, just to kind of like pick up a thread that Dan just dropped and continue it forward, what we see is a deeply entwined history between Russia and Ukraine, but that isn't the same thing as saying there is no historic thing that is Ukraine and that there is no Ukrainian identity or Ukrainian, authentic Ukrainian language. And I would encourage you to think about the way all national identity is, in a sense, invented, right? These are not primordial characteristics, but characteristics or identities that shape people's sense of self through historical processes that evolve over centuries. And in some ways, what we're seeing right now, this moment in Ukraine is, and I will pick this back up later, is a kind of compression of those processes in an adverse situation, which help those identities to really coalesce and become deeply internalized. I wanted to show you this map so that you could see that in the period of the Russian Empire before 1917, there was no place in the Russian Empire known as Ukraine. It was comprised of the territory that is today Ukraine was administratively known, divided up among a number of different regions. It was under Soviet power that something came into being that had an administrative area that came into being that had the name Ukraine. And so the best map I could find, unfortunately, was in French, but all of you are proficient enough in English, I think, that you can navigate what this is showing you, the formation of the Soviet Union in the period before World War II. This is not exact, this isn't representing the incorporation of these territories, but rather when they became distinct administrative units inside the Soviet Union. So Kazakhstan, for example, here in brown, was part of the Soviet Union at the end of the Civil War in 1921, or what became the Soviet Union, but it only became a distinct administrative territory in 1936. So I don't want you to think that these territories were incorporated in those years. These are the years when they were kind of drawn on a map in the way we see them now. And both Dan and I have spent a lot of the time already showing you maps. And so I just want to circle back to and reinforce the point that Dan made, that how we tell stories through maps is doing more than just representing space. It is narrating what those entities that are being represented are. And as he pointed out, here we see that this map is showing, only a small core of sort of legitimated Ukraine, and the rest of it is added as if gifted to Ukraine, and in a way that denies the present day attachments and local identifications with territories. So by saying, for example, added in 1922, that sort of rose-colored territory, that's if to say added only in 1922, and therefore no historical attachment to what is today Ukraine. And this is a way of looking at it somewhat differently. It's the same space, but it's narrated in a different way. So here we see, for example, 1945, if you look at the key, Czechoslovak, Ruthenia given to Ukraine. Again, gifted, added. This is the language that undermines the legitimacy of contemporary claims to this territory. And I would encourage you to question these constructions of space and political national identity, because again, all national identity is as Benedict Anderson, a famous historian, once described it, imagined communities. So the analogy to the Ukraine-Russian situation that I personally find most apt is Ireland and Great Britain. So if Great Britain, heaven forbid, invaded the Republic of Ireland, I don't think most of us would be sitting around talking about, well, the Republic of Ireland has only existed for 100 years as a separate country, so maybe the British have some legit cause to gripe about that. And so that's just not the way geopolitics works. In this moment, in 2022, the international community has recognized the territorial legitimacy and integrity of the Ukrainian state as it was constructed with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So this is really just a brief lesson in thinking carefully about how things are represented and the ways in which those representations then telegraph a political message. So I want to now turn to a focus on, and I have to move something so I can actually see the text, Soviet nationality policy from 1917, here without the typo, to 1991. And the starting point is that is the recognition that from the very beginning, the Soviet Union, the Soviet government had an uncomfortable relationship with both Russian national identity and especially non-Russian peoples inside the Soviet Union. In Marxist terminology, imperialism, bad. We don't want to be imperialists. And so, Russian empire is already from the get-go problematic, and integrated into Soviet ideology was a rejection of a kind of self-representation of the Soviet Union as an imperial project, as a continuation of the Russian Empire. And that distancing was grounded in a Marxist worldview about national identity and its implications for the Bolsheviks. In a Marxist worldview, the thing that should unite people is class, not nationality. And national identity, nationalism, was seen as a kind of false consciousness. And so the Bolsheviks set out to create allegiances that cut across ethnic boundaries and instead emphasized class alliances, especially the unity of workers, peasants, and soldiers. That was one of the foundational slogans of the Bolshevik Revolution. At the same time, they confronted the very clear reality that there had been both national separatist movements brewing in the Russian Empire for a long time already, as my colleague Dan has already underscored, and also the fact that people felt these identities. They identified with their co-religionists, with people who had the same language, shared languages, and so they had to grapple with creating a new sense of identity that was reorganized along socialist lines, that would also reject this imperial legacy of the Russian Empire, and that would also fit within the rhetoric of the day in the international community, which was about national self-determination. And here I draw your attention to the negotiations in Versailles about the settlement for World War I. I hope you can't hear that. There's some noise coming from the hallway. The settlement of World War I, in which the fallen Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires yielded new nation states that were built on a principle of varying degrees of national self-determination. And so the Soviet Union brought this ideology of national self-determination, which was, kind of in part of the zeitgeist in the 19-teens and 20s, and applied it inside the borders of the Soviet Union. And what that meant was that the non-Russian nationalities of the Soviet Union would be able to, in theory, choose their own destiny. In practice, however, that's not how it worked. In practice, the Russians fought, the Reds fought a civil war to bring these non-Russian areas into a greater Soviet Union to partially restore the Russian Empire. And the kind of compromise ideologically and pragmatically to keep these areas inside the Soviet Union and to kind of square the circle ideologically with this Marxist antipathy toward nationalism was to allow for different parts of the Soviet Union, different peoples within the Soviet Union to express themselves in a way that, to use the phrase at the time, was national in form and socialist in content. So, you know, speaking very kind of to paraphrase, the nationality policy in the Soviet Union was basically like, sure, go ahead, you know, eat your national dishes, speak your non-Russian languages, wear your national dress, have your national literature. That's all cool, no problem. But the content of all of that stuff, there has to be socialist. That literature, those plays, those you know, the music, all of that has to feed into the project of building socialism. So it could take these different superficial forms, but the substance of it had to conform ideologically with the agenda that was set in Moscow. And there's a historian, Terry Martin, who's written an excellent book, and he describes this as an ostentatious display of national characteristics. So, you know, pour all you want into wearing national dress and have your national languages, but the content must be infused with socialism. Now, the kind of unexpected consequence of this policy was that it actually served to further entrench and solidify those national differences. And we see this really vividly in Central Asia, where national identities, Kazakh, Uzbek, Tajik, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, had not been as distinct. They were still quite amorphous. They were forming among elites, but it was in the Soviet period that these really congealed, and that the distinctions between, for example, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and Karakalpak, that those lines were drawn much more clearly. In the Western parts of the Soviet Union, we see this as well. For example, between Belarus, Ukrainian, and Russian. And those languages evolved in increasingly divergent trajectories under this policy of national in form, socialist in content. It did not begin with Soviet power, but it continued to build and deepen under Soviet control. So World War II, as you all well know, was quite a formative experience in Soviet national identity. Soviet Union lost, in absolute terms, a greater number of people than any other combatant in World War II. Approximately 27 million soldiers and civilians perished in World War II. And this really consolidated a pan-Soviet national identity, because it was this terrible trial by fire that the entire nation endured together. And so you have the solidification of these sort of sub-national identities, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Russian, etc., under this umbrella of a quite real pan-Soviet identity. People could think of it as a nesting doll, to use a regionally appropriate metaphor, that you could have multiple identities. Soviet identity is on the outside of that matryoshka doll, and under that you would be Ukrainian, but you also might have a sense of regional identity. Western and Eastern Ukraine, very different places. And so people navigated multiple layered identities, and they could speak multiple languages, even as Russian was the language of the Soviet Union in general. But so in the post-Stalin era, that is after 1953, you have this really quite robust pan-Soviet identity, but it sits alongside simmering resentments about regional tensions, about the allocation of resources to different parts of the Soviet Union. The ethnic Russians had their own resentments, looking at places like Central Asia as a drain on financial resources. You have places in Western Ukraine, for example, resenting the way that they are, that the Russian language is being forced upon them in schools, not a lot of Ukrainian language schools, cut off from historic ties across the border in what was now Poland. So on the surface, it looks like there is this cohesive Soviet identity, but there are also tensions that are brewing. I will move on now to post-Soviet Ukraine and the politics of identity. So we see that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there is this complicated, conflicted situation that's already there. And it has built on the kinds of historic ties that Dan started us off with. And I just want to hit a few highlights and then talk to you about why they matter. You've probably heard about the Orange Revolution in late 2004, early 2005. And the thrust of this revolution was about charges of a presidential election being rigged in favor of the pro-Russian candidate. Protests snowballed. The results were annulled. There was another runoff, and the pro-EU candidate was inaugurated in his stead. In the next round of elections, the fates were reversed and Yanukovych did become the president. But what it shows us is in this first revolution, the key issue is Ukraine going to face Moscow or is it going to face Brussels? Is it heading further down the path of integration into Western Europe, or is it going to remain in Russia's orbit? And here I would bring us back to this idea of national self-determination. That is the business of the Ukrainian people to decide whether they want to be oriented east or west. And that is an internal discussion for the Ukrainian people themselves to resolve without undue influence from either east or west. In the October Revolution, the outcome was a reassertion of a westward orientation. That was then, there was backpedaling then, and then that led us to another revolutionary moment in 2014, known as alternatively the Revolution of Dignity or the Maidan Revolution, referring to the square on which these events primarily took place. It was again centered on this tension between looking east or west. And at that point, the pro-Russian candidate Yanukovych was removed. In the immediate wake of those events, there were a series of aftershocks. And those aftershocks included things that are now well known to you. The Russian forcible invasion and annexation of Crimea, and the declarations of independence by two regions in eastern Ukraine, Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. I would say here that you have to remember that the motivations, the Russians in all of these cases were meddling in the internal affairs of the Ukrainians. And so there were tensions for sure regarding the relationship of these areas to Kyiv, but Russia was putting its finger on the scales to tip the dynamics in favor of Russian-speaking Ukrainians on the ground. And so what we see when we look over this decade of tumult and the now, 8 years of tumult that has happened when things have really ratcheted up in recent years, we see a struggle for post-Soviet Ukraine to define what does it mean to be Ukrainian. And there are two pieces here that I think are important to unravel. One is defining a Ukrainian as an ethnic group, principally as someone who speaks the Ukrainian language. And the other is Ukrainian as a citizen of Ukraine. And what appears to be, have happened over the course of the 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union is a growing understanding of Ukrainianness, especially among younger people, let's say the under 40s, as something that is not determined strictly by whether or not you speak Ukrainian. That being Ukrainian is about being a citizen of an independent Ukraine. And for those who did not grow up in the Soviet Union, that orientation toward Moscow is not as strongly felt, if at all. And that is not to say that there isn't a kind of orbit and affinity to a shared heritage, but it is not a coterminous one. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague now that the dog has gone on to greener pastures, and I do apologize.
Paula, that was heroic, and but terrible karma that just as your presentation ends, it quiets down. But I think all of us in this Zoom room have been there before. Unfortunately, in the pandemic, where we've had to be on Zoom and lots of other things are happening in the background, and really that was quite remarkable. I'm going to spend the final 10 minutes of the presentation drawing us into the story of Ukrainian Jewish relations, which might seem like a bit of an odd thing to do, but the reason I'm doing so is because the story of Ukrainians' relationships with Jews has become a really important talking point for both Volodymyr Zelensky and for Putin in the war. So some of you may have seen that Putin claims that what he is trying to do with the war is to denazify Ukraine. And sometimes that includes the accusation that Ukrainians are all fascists, that Ukraine is overrun by anti-Semites, by people that are, basically reincarnating the Third Reich. So what we're going to do now is try to unpack some of those claims. We're going to look at the historical relationship between Ukrainians and Jews, but we'll also look at what Jewish life in contemporary Ukraine looks like and how it's actually changed since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Jews have lived in the Ukraine for hundreds of years. Jewish presence goes back to the 12th century, when Ukraine was under the rule of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was in the 1600s and 1700s. Jews settled there in large numbers and played quite an important economic role. There were important Jewish religious, political, and cultural movements that flourished there. Some of you may have heard of the Hasidic movement or Hasidic Jews. They get their start in the area that is now the Ukraine. Some of you might be familiar with Sholem Aleichem. Have you ever heard of Fiddler on the Roof? Sholem Aleichem was the author of the work of literature that would later, of course, become the musical. The areas of Ukraine were also home to flourishing Jewish political movements of the 20th century, among them the Zionist movement. Now, Ukraine wasn't just an area of Jewish economic flourishing, of cultural and political life. It was also a place where many tragedies befell Jews that were living there. In the 17th century, Ukrainian leader Bogdan Khmelnytsky led a massive peasant Ukrainian uprising against the Polish rulers. The problem was that Jews were considered by many Ukrainians to be a kind of proxy for Polish rule, and they were targeted as well, and thousands of Jews were killed in violence that swept through the region. You might ask, why is it that Jews were associated with the Polish rulers of these lands? Polish rulers of these lands under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth oftentimes leased out their land to Jews, and what that meant is that In exchange for a fee, Jews would be responsible for collecting taxes or for running taverns in these areas. So especially on the issue of taxes, Jews became a kind of symbol for the Polish rulers, who oftentimes didn't even live in the areas where Ukrainian peasants were revolting. So we already have this layer of economic tension that played a role in hostility between Jews and Ukrainians, or more accurately, hostility from Ukrainians towards Jews. That was aggravated and made worse during the First World War and in the period of Ukrainian independence and the period of civil war that followed. Ukrainians that opposed the Red Army, that opposed Bolshevik rule, that of course would later become Soviet rule, these Ukrainians murdered tens of thousands of their Jewish neighbors in these regions. And the reason is that they accused Jews of being supporters of the Bolsheviks, of being communists. And in fact, they essentially insisted that communism itself was Jewish. So to many Ukrainians, Bolshevism and Judaism, Bolsheviks and Jews were one and the same. This, of course, wasn't the historical reality on the ground. The fact that there were several prominent Jewish leaders in the communist movement and among the Bolsheviks exacerbated this myth that all Jews supported Bolshevik rule. So in part because of that accusation, now, of course, layered on top of those economic resentments of Jews, there was this massive, massive violence, which claimed tens of thousands of lives. The story gets worse. During the Second World War, when the Nazis invade the territory of Ukraine, when they're invading the Ukrainian lands in June 1941, they enticed some Ukrainians to assist them in the murder of Jews. And the way that they did that was to say that Jews were Bolsheviks, and that in a sense, by murdering Jews, they were avenging, or they were engaging in revenge against the Bolsheviks and for all the crimes that the Soviet Union had inflicted on Soviet Ukraine. Paula didn't speak as much about this, so I should probably say a word or two about this. Ukrainians did experience persecution under Soviet rule that included mass arrests and executions, but most notably for the Ukrainian memory and Ukrainian national imagination, there was a period between 1932 and 1933 where Soviet rulers engaged in forced grain requisitions that resulted in a famine that killed 3.5 million people. And many claim that this was a genocide that was enacted by the Soviet Union on Ukrainians. So you can imagine, with that historical memory and backdrop, and if you associate Jews with Bolsheviks, why that sort of hatred was directed by Ukrainians towards Jews. So during this period of the Holocaust, some Ukrainians did indeed assist the Nazis in the murder of Jews. And this wasn't a murder that, how do I put this? In the popular imagination, when we think of the Holocaust, oftentimes we think of cattle cars, we think of death camps. But the Jews that were murdered in this area of the lands of Ukraine were murdered like right outside their towns. They were murdered in ditches, and they were oftentimes murdered by their neighbors, of course, with supervision of the Nazis. So it's for all of those reasons that some Jews view ethnic Ukrainians as historically anti-Semitic. But that's not where the story ends. In fact, the story changes quite dramatically. And it's here that I want to turn to Ukrainian-Jewish relations in independent Ukraine. So since 1991, Ukraine has been trying to build a multi-ethnic and democratic society. It's far from perfect, but many Jews do feel at home there. Surveys show that Jews living in Ukraine today experience relatively low levels of anti-Semitism. In fact, if you were to compare those surveys with Jews living in France, Jews living in France report much higher instances of anti-Semitism. Recent decades have also brought about a flourishing of synagogues, of Jewish schools, of community centers, and Jewish aid organizations estimate that about 200,000 Ukrainian Jews, some of them religious and many more not, are integrated into the life of the country. But perhaps the most notable indication that there has been a significant shift is the fact that the president, Volodymyr Zelensky's Jewishness was barely considered a factor in his 2019 campaign. And of course, he was elected as president by 73% of the population. So there has really been an important and significant shift. That's not to say that there aren't elements in Ukrainian politics that trend on the radical right and that are anti-Semitic. We, of course, see that today in practically every country. In Europe, we see it in North America, and we certainly have elements of hatred here in Australia as well. One other comment to make about Putin's claim that he's intending to denazify the country. So, of course, Putin is drawing on what Paula described as this kind of rallying identity that cut across much of the former Soviet Union during the Second World War, when, as Paula said, per capita, more citizens of the Soviet Union perished than any other country fighting Nazi rule. So when you claim that your enemy are Nazis, that hits a hot button in the imagination of many of Putin's supporters. But not only are the claims about anti-Semitism untrue, but they're also disingenuous because Ukraine is not the Third Reich. It's a free and democratic state. It's a government that was popularly elected and that, for the most part, has protected the rights of all of its citizens. So I know that we have painted this rather complex picture of entanglements of language, of identity, of history. I hope that we've shed some light into some of the complexities that are animating the conflict right now as it's unfolding. And I know Paul and I are very much happy to answer any questions that you may have of the presentation, or broadly questions you may be having as you're watching this war unfold.
I'm going to invite people to offer some questions now. So I've got a first question here from Albert Isaacs. And Albert, you've already unmuted yourself, so let's go.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you both, Daniel and Paula. Very, very informative. Look, the question I'm going to ask might be difficult to answer because it's a bit nebulous, but what is the religious breakup within the Ukraine? I see 5 different groups: practicing Orthodox, other Christians, practicing Jews, other religions, and atheists.
That's an interesting breakdown that you offered, because I would do it a little bit, not that that was wrong, it's not wrong, but I would describe it a little bit differently. I would say that there's, sure, there are some people that are secular, but this is generally speaking a place where there are a lot of people of faith. And broadly speaking, I would describe them as Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And then within each of those groups, there are subgroups. And in the Christian category, in our Christian basket, we have Orthodox Christians, then we have Uniate Christians, who are sort of basically Catholics, but where the right is in Ultra Slavonic, but they recognize the authority of the Pope. There are Baptists in this part of the world as well. But if you look hard at the Orthodox part of it, things really go off the rails because there is a conflict. So do we not say Uniates anymore? Oh, I apologize. I do.
Sorry, that's
good to know. Thank you for
just me jumping in at the moment.
I really appreciate that.
Thank
you very much. Yeah. I apologize. That's the first I'm hearing of your sensitivity around that.
They're one of the 26 different Catholic churches in the Catholic Church.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. And but among the Orthodox Christians, there is one group that recognizes the authority of the patriarch in Moscow, And then there is another group that sought permission from the patriarch in Constantinople, what we would all call Istanbul, for who's the kind of big head of all of it, to have a separate patriarchate in Ukraine. So that created one schism, and then there's additional subsequent breaks, including some that are unfolding in real time right now. So it's a bit of a mess, but I do want to also make sure that people are well aware that there is a pretty significant Muslim minority in Ukraine, and that they like the Ukrainians who suffered under Soviet power. They too suffered greatly, being deported en masse in one of the most notable incidents of collective punishment that was meted out by the Soviet state against the Crimean Tatars, who were deported deep into the hinterland of Central Asia, and did not have their rights fully restored, even into the mid-1950s, when some of the other groups were allowed to repatriate to their historic homelands. Crimean Tatars were not initially allowed to do that. That didn't happen until the 1970s. And there are a lot of Crimean Tatars who are Muslims who are in positions of political authority right across Ukraine, but especially in the southern areas, and complicated religious map there. Dan, would you like to add anything?
Thank you for that wonderful answer. I've learned so much. I'll just say very briefly on the Jewish question. The question of Jews and faith is also somewhat complicated, because under Soviet rule for decades, religious practice was very much discouraged, if not suppressed and repressed. So Jews in the independent Ukraine are oftentimes, from this history of being defined as a nationality under Soviet policy, some are coming to faith in relatively recently, even if they identify or define as Jewish. And much of that religious revival has been through religious leadership that comes from the outside in. The Chabad movement, which is a Hasidic Jewish movement, is especially prominent in the Ukraine.
Thank you. I would like to ask either of you whether you have any sense of sympathy within Ukraine for what Russia is doing, and the reverse, sympathy within Russia for the Ukrainian national self-determination and its Western focus, which I would imagine so many Russians thought that was where they were going, toward a more Western kind of lifestyle and aspiration. So I just wonder whether we can get a sense of either of those.
This is an exceptionally difficult question to ask when we're trying to gauge popular opinion in Russia, in part because political opposition is not only frowned upon, but brutally suppressed. I'm going to type in the name of a reporter with the New York Times, somebody named Masha Gessen, who's been writing a little bit about the reaction on the ground among Russians. So, Paula, I'm going to speak here somewhat as an interloper, but please do correct me if I'm wrong when speaking about Russian politics and society. So despite the fact, as I mentioned, that Putin does brutally repress and stifle dissent and controls the media, there is also significant popular support on the ground by Russians for this war. And some of those reasons are similar to Putin's sense that there is a Russian world and a Russian empire that should be restored, and that Russians have experienced humiliation in global politics, and that this is one way in which they can restore the Russians to dignity and strength. There is an element here, and Paula, again, I'll encourage you to tell me I'm dead wrong about this. An element of religion also plays into this. Elements of the Russian Church, Russian Orthodox Church, have very close ties to Putin, and also support the war in religious terms, and this idea of Russian expansionism, sometimes is infused with religious language as well. As for the question of the citizens of Ukraine and support for Russians, there too we need to tread carefully when thinking about popular opinion. But anecdotally, from speaking with colleagues in the region, the sense that I've gotten, and Paula, I'm curious what you would say about this as well, is that despite the fact that 50% of Ukrainians speak Russian as their mother tongue, and despite the fact that nearly all Ukrainians are bilingual and operate with both languages, we shouldn't confuse that linguistic dexterity with support for Putin, and that if there was support, as there was among some, for turning towards Russia or for support of separatists in the eastern regions, much of that support has been crushed by the sheer brutality of the invasion. Putin's tactics have stunned much of Ukraine's population. So if already there was support for Zelensky and support for turning west, I think it's been supported and strengthened significantly. Paula?
Yeah, I would concur with that completely. And I would only add that I talked about the kind of consolidation and development of an independent Ukrainian post-Soviet identity that was not contingent on language. And I think that what we've seen since the 24th of February is this kind of like time-lapse compression of a further consolidation of that Ukrainian independent identity, and that including in Donetsk and Lugansk. And there are reports about people being forcibly evacuated but deported from those regions into Russia, and Russian citizens being moved in. Those population movements are about creating a new reality on the ground, because the Russians didn't like the reality they were facing, which was that even those territories would not readily be occupied and held by Russia. So there is, I would say, there was some empathy. Let me restart that and say, Zelensky was not perfect. He was, widely criticized, and with good reason, for being ineffective in many ways. And his surge of popularity, both not just abroad but at home, is a direct consequence of this Russian aggression. So not just Putin's popularity rose, but Zelensky's did as well. The other thing I would add is that we need to be careful not to conflate capitalism and democracy. So, did Russians think they were heading in the direction of the West? In terms of capitalism, absolutely. A kind of petro-state version of capitalism, a deeply inequitable version of capitalism. But nonetheless, capitalism was off and running in Russia. But democracy foundered in the 90s, and democracy has been struggling in Russia, since Putin came into office. So it's been a long time coming that authoritarianism is on the rise in Russia. And what I'm hearing from my Ukrainian colleagues is deep frustration when they have spilled their own blood and they have fought in the streets through multiple revolutions to sustain their democracy. They're deeply disappointed and frustrated with the Russians, in Ukrainian eyes, basically being unwilling to fight for their democracy. So there is not a lot of sympathy among Ukrainians for the risks that Russians would have to take to resist the current regime. The consequences of that would be, if you speak out against the war, you can get 15 years in jail. But the Ukrainians don't have a lot of sympathy for that, understandably, when bombs are raining down upon civilians And the Russians, from the Ukrainian perspective, have let the opportunity for democracy slip away from them over the last 20 years.
Can I ask a follow-up question, whether the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church has made any recent statements regarding the brutality? I mean, even he should be somewhat appalled, you would imagine, as to what's going on.
Yeah, my understanding is that the Russian Patriarch has come out in support of Putin.
Right, so no mitigating statements.
No.
Wow.
Actually, can I add something before another question, which is what the sort of slogan of the Russian Empire was nationality, orthodoxy, autocracy. And when people talk about the speech that Putin gave on the eve of this unprovoked attack, as his desire to restore the Soviet Union, it's actually not the Soviet Union he's trying to restore. It is the Russian Empire. And he is, like Dan said earlier, you know, working in alliance with the Russian Patriarch and invoking the authority of the Russian Orthodox Church in the same way that the Romanovs did.
I just wanted to point out, as Paula was speaking, I found an article in the conversation that it goes into this topic just a little bit more deeply. So if during our conversation or afterwards you wanted to do a little bit more reading, it's there for you.
Can I ask, if no one else is, I'm just bursting with so many. It's fascinating, the sort of multiculturalism, as it were, that the Soviet Union and also the Russian Empire previously under Catherine the Great managed to put in place, allowing groups, Muslims largely in the territories she conquered, to remain Muslim, but that being the condition on which they would accept her rule. So I'm wondering about this policy, which one would think could backfire, as Paula, you were indicating. It kind of entrenches differences and conflicts, and I wonder how long that can hold.
Shall I take that, Dan? Kind of, I would say, so far so good in some ways, you know. How long can it hold? I mean, one thing to think about, of course, is that Russia itself is today, it's not just about Russia wanting to expand into these former imperial territories. Russia itself is still an imperial power. And there are lots and lots, I think 20% of the population of Russia is non-Russian. And there's, you know, lots of Muslims, there are Buddhists, there are Jews, there are lots and lots of different ethnic groups. And we see in the troops that they sent into Ukraine that they are willing to use these non-ethnic Russians as cannon fodder as well. Is that going to then translate in, let's say, some far-flung corner of Siberia, in Buryatia, for example, into resistance? There is really no historical evidence that that's to be expected. That's not to say it can't happen, but there's just not really precedent for that. So we think, well, you know, why are people not chafing under this oppression? Why are they not taking to the streets to resist it? Well, Russians have a long history of not doing that, and it's really the exception and not the rule. And of course, now the consequences of resistance are very dire, and they are not joking around about it.
I have nothing positive to add to that realistic and, you know, depressing assessment. Yeah.
It seems to be the same people asking questions, and for my part, I apologise for that. This is a follow-up to what you were saying, Daniel, about Putin's description of his right-wing opponents as Nazis. Is this new, or has he used this term for some time? And is he the only Russian leader who has used this term, or has it been used before? Of course, I'm sure that Putin is well aware of the way that many people, including Jews, feel about the use of that term.
Right. Okay. So, of course, Putin is branding people that would be described as being further to the left of him as Nazis. So, and of course, how we describe right and left here is a bit complicated, but in terms of Zelensky's turn towards the EU, I think that would be defined as left to someone like Putin. The short answer is no. I think that the Second World War left such a deep imprint on the experience of the Soviet Union and its citizens that political leaders constantly through the era, and then Paula can speak to this further, invoked the term Nazis when trying to brand people as political opponents. But that doesn't mean that everything is the same. As a historian that works primarily on Jewish life in Eastern Europe, I am struck by the fact that in this war, Putin is not drawing on anti-Semitic rhetoric, right? Far from it. That is a really important difference. If we look at the long stretch of the Russian Empire's history and then later the Soviet Union, in efforts to broaden or consolidate its power, Soviet rulers or rulers of the Russian Empire would sometimes play upon anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic fears as a way to get things done. I think that Russia now has different enemies that it brands as the ultimate enemy number one. So that is an important difference in my view. Paula?
Yeah, just to elaborate a little bit further, they would, during the Cold War, the United States might be characterized as fascists. I mean, there's a lot wrong with the United States, but fascism doesn't really, at least not yet, doesn't fit the definition of what's happening in the United States. It certainly didn't in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So there's a kind of rhetorical flourish there happening that now, however, seems to have a different kind of valence to it. And of course, not just in the Soviet, not just with the word fascist, Nazi, those kinds of words, but also words like traitor, provocateur, cosmopolitan, a word that has a kind of anti-Semitic tone to it.
Really?
There's a long history. I'm not saying Putin uses these words, but I'm saying that across the whole of the Soviet era, that kind of extremist language was used as a mechanism for denunciation. And in a sense, this sort of continues that, but now with really very, dire, deadly consequences. So I would see, while fascism, Nazism, that has its own legacy, it is also part of this larger pattern of using language to delegitimize and to denounce that we saw very vividly in the 1930s in particular.
Thank you, Paula. I've just received a question from Mark that was posted by somebody in the chat, and I'll just read it out to you, Paula, as well. It states, could you comment on the Western representation of the situation of Ukrainian refugees as people like us, and the negative comparison with the numbers of non-white refugees who've gone through similar invasions, often by Western powers? This is a very, very complicated thing. And I think that the question is really a comment that I would agree with. Part of the reason, now I should say, just as before I say anything, Paul and I both have worked in the region. We have colleagues there. So the plight of Ukrainian refugees is something that is terrible and real to us. And we have colleagues on the ground that are facing these terrible circumstances. But it doesn't escape us that the attention that they are receiving in Western media is exponentially greater than the millions upon millions of refugees in the Middle East, in Africa, the people that don't look like us or aren't Christian. It's just, so that those stories are often sometimes a footnote in the news, or they're just not as prominent. And I think that part of that certainly has to do with the fact that this feels close to home, that it is in Europe. I know that from the vantage point of the Jewish community, many of us trace our origins in Australia, at least, to Eastern Europe. So this is very, very close to home, and it does bring up memories of persecution, of exile, of a refugee experience. But still, we are paying greater attention to this than to other disasters that are unfolding in the world as we speak. Paula, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to add something, which is that racism is a terrible thing, right? I mean, that is the explanation. It is just straight up racism. And you can see it really vividly in how African students, there were international African students in Ukraine trying to flee the war, and they were treated differently at the borders, turned away by Poles, by Romanians, etc. There's no explanation for that other than racism. And we need to call it out for what it is. Two things can be true at the same time. One is that Ukrainians are in absolutely desperate need right now. And two is they're not the only ones. And so while, like Dan said, I am animated about this cause right now because this is a part of the world I've been studying for 40 years, right? I've been to Kharkiv, I've been to Kiev. I love Ukraine. I love Russia too. And I've been going to Russia since 1986. So I, of course, am moved to try to do something right now because this is the part of the world that I study. Do I think about how disgraceful it is that I did not do anything for the last decade while Yemenis have been suffering? Yes, I do think about that. And that will be the next step. And so I feel like I am drawn into this plight because now it has touched me. And it is to my shame that that's what it took. But today is a new day.
I wonder whether I could add a comment to what you've said or elaborate on what you've said. A couple of years ago, I read a survey of the items in the press and where they came from. Precedence was given to stories from Australia, followed by stories from New Zealand. Next was Great Britain, then the USA and Canada, then Europe, and far down, the rest of the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's not unique to Australia.
No. Oh, no.
If you read I'm a regular reader of the Washington Post, the coverage of Africa in the Washington Post it's virtually non-existent. And that blindness, there is suffering in the world as a consequence of that blindness, and that blindness is difficult to understand in terms that other than that are at least partly informed by racism.
Thank you so much for that, Daniel and Paula, for answering those questions. It really, I think if we looked at the three aims of the Council of Christians and Jews, we've met all of those today. And I'm going to hand over now to Sister Marianne Dacey to offer an official vote of thanks.
First of all, I want to say thank you for a very erudite and interesting presentation that the deeply entwined history between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, I appreciated the step-by-step unrolling of history that you started with. The 500 years when Ukrainian lands are been under the rule of powerful states, and you come to the stage of the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union, there was an uncomfortable relationship with non-Russian identities. It was a huge, massive identities. But the attitude of it served to solidify national differences. Wonderful. I mean, it's not wonderful and not wonderful in one way. It's always ambiguous, that sort of thing. And then you brought us right up to the present day, starting from 1991, how the Ukraine have they have now a national identity, perhaps leading towards the West. And I also enjoyed the part that you brought out the Jews of Ukraine. It's been a most interesting presentation, and you certainly know a lot about your topic. So thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much, very much, Marion. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. It really is a very timely presentation, and I just have a couple of quick advertisements before we officially finish. So I'm going to share my screen. And as I said before, the Council of Christians and Jews Victoria has a YouTube page, and you can see there a number of our most recent presentations that are up there. And this presentation will be up on YouTube within the next week, all things being equal. We also have a presence on Facebook. We invite you to, actually, before we go back to that, if you do ever watch a video on YouTube, can you click like and subscribe, because that helps us get more traction. When people are going through YouTube, the algorithm works a little more in our favour. Also, we invite you to like our Facebook page and our website, ccjvic.org.au, and you can sign up there, subscribe, you can donate, and you can be part of the system that we have here of engaging in important dialogue about things that bring us together. So thank you again, everyone, for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Bye.